Good morning. I am Jean Pierce from the League of Women Voters of Illinois Issues and Advocacy Committee. Welcome to our 2021 Issues Briefing Program after the graduated rate tax income tax campaign. Now what? The link that you clicked on will be open all morning. So if for some reason you get disconnected, just click on it again. We will be recording this session. It will be available on the League's website. While our speakers are talking, we invite you to click on chat at the bottom of your screen and type in your own questions. I'll be monitoring the chat and will ask as many questions as we can. Also, if you would like to be part of the League's Google group for fiscal policy, please type your email in the chat. Now, I welcome issue specialist Ann Corder, who will introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Jean. Last November, after our heartbreaking defeat of the Fair Tax Amendment, a member of the League's fiscal policy Google groups brought to our attention a headline in Crane's Chicago Business: "Failure of fair tax is an opportunity." Well, we are pleased to have the author of that piece with us today to share her perspective on the opportunity ahead of us. Paula Worthington is a senior lecturer at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, where she also serves as academic director of the school's Policy Lab program and faculty lead on its MPP program. She is consistently recognized for excellence in teaching since joining Harris in 2004. While on leave from Harris in 2017 to 2018, she served as senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors in Washington, D.C. Dr. Worthington's interests are in state and municipal fiscal policies. She is currently co-chair of the Metropolitan Planning Council's Transportation Committee and a member of the State of Illinois' Budgeting for Results Commission. She also serves on Cook County's Independent Review Forecasting Commission. Dr. Worthington received her PhD in economics from Northwestern University. Lisa Christensen-Gee, as the Director of Special Initiatives for the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, advises organizations and coalitions on taxation and policy solutions that promote equity. She is a resource to advocates, lawmakers, and the media on trends and developments in the state tax policy landscape, the impact of proposed or recent tax policy changes on citizens and tax budgets, and equitable tax policy design. Prior to joining ITEP in 2016, Lisa served as an analyst with the Fiscal Policy Center at Voices for Illinois Children. She worked on advancing the Fair Tax campaign with the Shriver Center on Poverty Law and has also worked on improving federal family tax credits with the National Women's Law Center. Lisa holds a Master's of Public Policy and a law degree from the University of Chicago. And finally, our most distinguished speaker, Illinois State Senate President Don Harmon, was first elected in 2002 and is currently serving his 6th term in the Illinois Senate. He was elected Senate President in 2020. Senator Harmon championed tax reform in Illinois for over 10 years, probably longer, to provide fiscal stability and ease the tax burden of working families. He has also championed early childhood education, cleaning up state government, curbing gun violence, strengthening voters' rights, marriage equality, expanded health care for low-income families, and protecting the environment while promoting green energy policy. A lifelong resident of Oak Park, Senator Harmon holds both a law degree and an MBA from the University of Chicago. We are proud to welcome you to the League's webinar today. Dr. Worthington will speak first.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate this morning. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides with you this morning. So if you could let me know whether those are showing up on your screen, I would be grateful.
They are, thank you.
Excellent, thank you so much. So what I thought I'd do today is lay out a little background information on our state and its fiscal situation, talk a little bit about recent developments on the fiscal side and the real economic side, and then identify and discuss a few things that make me worried. I hope we'll also talk about those opportunities that were the subject matter of my Cranes piece a few months ago. So the first thing I want to just briefly highlight is that Illinois is not a high spending state. The state and combined local governments spending per capita of about $9,100 is below the US average of about $9,400. And even as a share of personal income, we are below the US average. So need to put that idea aside. What about taxes? We often hear that Illinois is a high tax jurisdiction. Well, it turns out that when you, again, looking at both the state and its local governments, what you find is that revenues per capita are below US averages. And that's even true when we limit attention to own source revenues, which are the revenues that the state and the local governments can themselves control. But it is also true that when you look just at tax revenues, those revenues are higher in Illinois than the US average. So we have a bit of a disconnect here. We have that general revenues, own source revenues seem low, but tax revenues seem high. And the reconciliation of that is basically through current charges for services. Our state and local governments charge less per capita for the kinds of services they're providing than do other states. And I can say more about that down the line if there's interest. But these figures are somewhat limited. Of course, they're a little stale coming from the 2017 Census of Governments. They also combine state and local governments together, which is really important when you're making comparisons across states, because states have very different structures for their spending and revenue raising responsibilities. But now let's just take a look at what the situation is here in Illinois right now. As I know, many of you already know that the latest data for the state of Illinois and the fiscal side has actually been a little bit better than we might have hoped. Fiscal year 2020 individual income tax collections came in really better than we thought they would when we were thinking about this last fall. Another thing we saw in recent months is that sales tax revenues have also been pretty robust. Year to date, they're up 4.1% relative to last year. And it's worth pausing a moment to recognize why that is the case. All right, it's the case because we've had a pretty aggressive federal posture and a lot of stimulus coming in, making direct payments to individuals, small businesses, propping up the unemployment insurance system, and also devoting money to state and local governments. On the real side, what we have is some evidence, of course, that in the big picture, things are a lot better than they were in March and April of last year. But I think we can also point out that even though unemployment rates are down from their peaks, we also can say we've lost a lot of jobs. 10 million, almost 10 million jobs at the national level, and then about 430,000 jobs here for the state of Illinois. So we're not out of the woods yet on the real side. So what's the problem? Well, the problem here is that we've run structural deficits for years. We've relied on borrowing to fill our budget gaps, and we haven't really moved forward to address our antiquated, regressive, and distortionary revenue structure. And in some instances, we've found it challenging to deliver the high quality services that our citizens deserve and our residents and businesses deserve. So this is just a quick picture to show you where Illinois looks, how it ranks relative to other states. Poorly, bottom of the barrel in terms of structural deficits over an extended period of time, over a 15-year period of time. We failed to collect enough revenues to cover our expenditures. After the Great Recession, where other states actually increased their contributions to their rainy day funds, so built up some reserves, Illinois did not. Illinois basically doesn't have a rainy day fund at all. And another example of our failure to plan ahead, you can see that we basically had very little funds in the state unemployment insurance trust fund. And that was true pre-COVID. That was January 1st, 2020. Whereas basically states are expected to keep enough dollars on hand to meet anticipated benefit obligations in a recession. Illinois clearly was underfunded in that regard. And then, of course, I know many of you know, probably in greater detail than I, we also know that our state pensions remain severely underfunded, haven't really made any progress on that front. So what have we done? Well, obviously, there are all kinds of regular ways we can borrow money, but there's also special ways that we can issue debt. And I want to highlight just a couple of those here. We've borrowed money from the Federal Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. We're not alone in that regard. About 20 states or so have taken out loans from that facility. They have to be paid back. And they can be paid back ultimately with higher employer payroll taxes or general obligation bond proceeds, but those then you'll have to repay those. So you have some options there, but still, that's a loan that has to be repaid. And similarly, we have taken out some loans through the municipal lending facility of the Federal Reserve. And we have a little under $3 billion outstanding on that at this time. We are the only state in the US to have tapped this line. So, we have these structural deficits. We borrow to plug them. What problems do we really have here? We have problems on the revenue side, the service provision side, and our long-term obligation side. And I know that the next panelist in particular will be talking in detail about some of the revenue ideas. So I'm going to hold off further commentary on that until she's presented and we have some active Q&A. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the service provision to just put a little meat on those bones. We know that the state has an obligation to provide basic administrative governmental services to all state residents. But in particular, we want to highlight that the state has an obligation to provide for services for particularly vulnerable populations. How do we do on that front? Answer, we struggle. DCFS, of course, has been in the news off and on for a number of years, struggling to meet its mission and goals to protect children who are in potentially risky or abusive environments. We have had revolving door of acting directors. We have had multiple audit findings of non-compliance. Lots of concerns there. That's something we should take seriously. What about the Illinois Department of Employment Security? Well, that's also been in the news, certainly in this last year. Obviously, IDES got slammed by that incredible surge in unemployment initial claims that came through as a result of the COVID shutdowns and subsequent economic disruptions. But that was true across the country, and not all systems buckled as much as ours did. So just to show you a couple of pictures of what that kind of looks like, here's one representation of an operational measure. So this is looking at the overpayment rates that the system has, even pre-COVID. In the 12 months ending March 31st, 2020, what we saw was that Illinois performed poorly in this regard. So it was issuing overpayments relative to benefits at a higher rate than other states. On the economic side of things, less about the sort of the operational piece, but on the economic side of things, we might care about the UI system's effectiveness in delivering income support to individuals who have been laid off. And there, what I think can show is a bit of a mixed story. This recipiency rate, which shows the fraction of the state's unemployed who get UI benefits. You can see by the blue line that Illinois was actually doing, about the same as the country, even a little bit better over an extended period of time. But that in 2020, when we really, encountered stresses on this entire system, whereas the country's national average was about 77%, for Illinois it was 67%. So we're 10 percentage points below the national average. And that means that we're doing a worse job of making sure our unemployed residents get the support for the UI system that they need. So with that, I'll just say a few things about our spending options and lay it out in a sort of a general way, and look forward to future, more conversation here during this session. My sense is that the state would really benefit from less discussion about one program here and one program there, and more discussion about basic priorities across these various domains, targeted populations, particularly vulnerable populations, or targeted services. I think we need to focus on evidence-based programs where there's actually evidence that a particular program is effective at delivering the results we want to see. And we also need to commit to funding program administration. It's not sexy, but we need to do that. And to sort of guide those sorts of efforts about priorities and then allocating resources in a way that is aligned with program effectiveness, what I would suggest is that the state's own budgeting for results efforts give us the start of a roadmap on that, because those efforts help us identify programs that deliver high returns on the state's investment, if you will. And that effort is now 10 years or so old, and I think it's really starting to deliver the goods. And sort of a related initiative is at the National Conference of State Legislatures, which has just established a Center for Results-Driven Governing. Again, the idea is to use evidence to help you understand which programs are effective and which aren't less so, and to allow that to guide your resource allocation and budgeting decisions. So with that, I think I will conclude my prepared remarks and be happy to take questions and engage with the other panelists shortly. So let me see about stopping my
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Worthington. That was great. We'll have a chance to do a couple of cleanup questions after all of the panelists have had a chance to present.
Terrific.
Okay, great. So is Lisa Christensen-Gee great? Welcome.
Hi, welcome. Thank you. I think it's a pleasure to be here as part of this great discussion. Sharing my slides here. All right, so when we think about what comes next after the fair tax, I also worked hard in this initiative and was saddened by that. I like to take a step back first. We know that revenue is going to need to be an important piece of it. And before we talk about tax policy, which to me is always exciting, but maybe not so for everyone, I want to lay some groundwork. And just sometimes we think about taxes as being separate from the economy or external to or problematic for. And my remarks are going to be coming from a place and an understanding that tax policy actually is a really critical component of how we achieve thriving communities, the well-being of individuals, households, and businesses. So the investments that we make, these services that have evidence that they help promote these things are worth funding, and funding through sustainable, adequate, and fair revenue mechanisms. And that's true especially during moments of economic squeeze or crisis, where it's critical that we keep money flowing into communities that will allow us to rebound faster, right? And also kickstart our economic well-being by making sure that small businesses continue to be supported. So when I think about the big picture, like how do we chart this course to making sure that we have a revenue system that is meeting our needs in a way that allows us to do that sustainably over a long period of time, I center the question of what is it that our communities need to thrive, and from there, answer the question of what is it going to take to get there. And as Paula has already laid out in her presentation, we know that the needs are great. And sometimes when taken all together can be a little bit overwhelming when we think about the current needs, right? What's needed in terms of offering support to families during this moment of COVID, meeting minimum investments in education, rebuilding a safety net that has been eroded due to the budget impasse over a number of years, tackling place-based disparities, and then also just how we pay for past services that have already been received or rendered and helped keep our communities getting what they need. These are high price tags, right? And we're not going to be able to close structural deficits, fix the revenue issue or concern with just one tax amendment or one major policy initiative, it's a long road. That's going to need to require a lot of different steps along the way, but we shouldn't despair about that, right? It's not necessarily our work. I find some support and confidence in this quote from Rabbi Tarfon. We don't have to finish the work, but neither are we at liberty to neglect it. So at this juncture, given that the challenge is great, what is some guidance about how we can orient ourselves to the task at hand? I think in the moment, this legislative session, the following year, my principles are really rooted in the sense of wanting to make sure that we keep money flowing into communities, particularly those with the greatest need at the moment, and that our efforts are aimed at providing support and cover to lawmakers to make the hard votes, to raise the revenue that's necessary to make that happen. And then also, in the wake of the fair tax failure, doing some bigger and broader visioning for what the ultimate destination is and how we get there incrementally along the way. All of those decisions, it's important to be made in light of a clear understanding of our current tax structure. And what we have here is a chart that you're probably familiar with. ITEP does every few years a comparison study of the tax liabilities across all 50 states, looking at both those taxes and fees and fines levied by state as well as local governments. And if you add those all up and express them as a single tax rate, you can see here that Illinois has a regressive tax structure. It's actually the 8th most regressive in the nation. And that's a technical term that means the higher your income, the lower your tax rate as a share of your income. And the lower your income, the higher your tax rate. So you can see here that in the average household making less than $22,000 a year pays almost twice as many taxes as a share of their income as a household making over $540,000. This is a tax structure that we call upside down. And it's not ideal for a lot of reasons. On its face, it's not equitable. But even more problematic is that it exacerbates other underlying disparities that we know that exist on the basis of race and ethnicity. These are disparities in both income as well as wealth. You'll see here, but due to a long history of extractionist economies, of explicit segregation that left out certain individuals in achieving economic opportunities, we have the legacies of those still in our society that mean we have a disproportionate number of people of color in the lower end of the income spectrum in our state, which means if those are the individuals on whom the tax burden is the highest, we are also exacerbating these underlying disparities that we are otherwise as a state trying to take moves to try to address and correct. I have a few slides here, don't have time to go into the details that explains what is driving that regressivity, right? It's not inherently the case that we have to have a tax structure with those features. There are ways to have sales taxes and excise taxes in our revenue portfolio, but then counterbalance the regressive effects that those have through really robust income taxes and other progressive taxes, which we'll talk about momentarily. And other states are achieving a better balance. I show here California compared to Illinois as an example of what they're doing, particularly with their income tax, to help make a difference in counterbalancing the regressive impact of their sales and excise taxes. So generally speaking, when we're thinking about or evaluating any new revenue mechanism and how is it going to impact tax equity, there are two basic principles we can keep in mind. Is it increasing or decreasing the burden at the low end of the income spectrum, which we know is already too high? And is it increasing or decreasing the tax burden at the top, right? Ideally, if we care about and value tax equity, we're going to want to be pulling down taxes at the low end of the income spectrum, or at least not increasing them, while bringing up taxes at the top right now, because these are the individuals who are currently paying the lowest share of their incomes and taxes. So before we dive into specific policy areas and revenue options, I just want to acknowledge that the state has made some important revenue raising steps in the last just few years, taking advantage of some new revenue streams that have been made available, updating some other ones. The motor fuel tax was updated for the first time in 30 years in 2019, which was an important step. And that these all collectively help make sure that there are more resources available to help pay for the things that make sure that our communities can thrive. However, by themselves, they're not a silver bullet, right? That gap is still big. The amount of money that we need to be able to just close what we're currently spending, let alone make new investments, is going to require much more. And the other thing to note is that all of these steps were regressive, which means they made the underlying tax inequities even worse. So when we think about the buckets of policy changes that could be sources of new dollars and that could help encourage our tax system in a more equitable manner, we have a couple of big buckets. The first is the corporate income tax. From where I sit, there's no trend that's been more blatant and problematic than the steady decline in corporate tax over the last 50 years. So currently, corporate tax as a share of profits it's at an all-time low. And that's being driven by a couple of things. One is that Illinois is a rolling conformity state, which means that for purposes of income tax, we are anchored to the federal government's tax provisions as it relates to defining federal adjusted gross income, and then we make adjustments from there. So certain tax cuts that are enacted at the federal level regularly get incorporated in Illinois tax law unless we take explicit action to reject or decouple from those tax changes. So this legislative session, you've probably already heard about efforts to decouple from some of the tax cuts included in the Federal CARES Act. That's going to be an important source of making sure that we don't lose existing revenue and at the hands of decisions of lawmakers that are not even our elected officials here in the state of Illinois. There's a couple of other things listed here. I will leave those for the slides. For you guys to review a little bit later, but note that the corporate income tax changes are all highly progressive. The corporate income tax is primarily paid by individuals who don't even live in our state. The majority of it, 79%, gets exported to individuals who are outside of Illinois, even outside of the United States. And of those who are paying the corporate income tax within our state, the vast majority of that, close to 60%, falls on the top 1% of earners, which means it's a very a very good progressive source of revenue raising. In the bucket of the personal income tax, right? Our options are more limited without the fair tax, but not non-existent. We have several poorly targeted tax breaks that are out of alignment with other states. The biggest, of course, is the exclusion of all retirement income. Illinois is one of only 3 states that has a broad-based income tax that excludes all retirement income. And especially as we have an aging demographic accompanied with the growing costs of caring for that demographic, it's a recipe for disaster to not have some measure of this income included in the tax base. There are ways to design that such that individuals who are truly living on fixed and low incomes could not be negatively impacted. And there are ways to administratively design grandfathering and rolling out the changes so that individuals have plenty of time to plan and make adjustments before they find themselves in that position of being retirees themselves. I believe that over the long term, we will want to have a graduated rate structure in the mix, particularly because so much of our ability to offset the other regressive tax sources depends on having a really robust progressive income tax, and graduated rates are an important component of being able to levy differential taxes on taxpayers at different abilities to pay. The sales tax is an important piece as well. The biggest opportunity here in terms of revenue raising is correcting the fact that we have an artificially small sales tax base that's not currently keeping up with the economy. Our sales tax law is currently written, was written at a time that really only anticipated goods being the primary form of transaction within the economy. But we know that over the decades, we have shifted more and more to a services-based economy, and frankly, our tax law just has not kept up. You'll see here that Illinois currently, as of 2017, was only taxing 29 services compared to states like Hawaii and Washington, who are taxing around 170. This is a potential source of a lot of new revenue for the state. The challenges are, of course, in terms of tax equity, it's the sales tax is a regressive tax. Even when you're just talking about services, it's not as targeted towards higher or moderate incomes as one might expect in practice because of how costs get passed down to businesses and then passed down to all consumers in the form of higher priced goods. But there are ways to couple any sort of sales tax changes with targeted means tested refundable credits that can help offset some of that impact on our households that are already paying a higher share of their income in taxes. I also want to touch briefly on, as Paula mentioned, right now, Illinois and the local governments aren't collecting enough user fees to cover even just the cost of certain services, right? So this is for the construction of roads, water, sewer, other infrastructure priorities. And there are some corrective policy responses identified here, including allowing non-home rule governments to impose some additional types of fees. Looking at one particular quasi-user fee is the motor fuel tax, which is a proxy for road use. While it's a great thing that we made up for some of the inflation losses recently by bringing that rate up, we know over the long term, as fuel efficiency standards continue to improve, that is a base that also is going to be eroding over time, and we need to look to new proxies such as mileage taxes. And the U.S. Department of Transit has been working with states to pilot and to test out how to get those sorts of taxes in place. These are also regressive revenue sources, but can be structured in a way to account for these ability to pay considerations. And finally, one of the prompts that I was given in preparing these remarks was to say, what is a bold option, right? What is the big, bold thing that we can do? And the answer is it's not a single thing. Honestly, it's probably all of the above, right? But another maybe bold idea or component that we haven't really talked about or explored a lot in the policy community when I have been here is thinking about not just taxing income or consumption, but taxing wealth. We know that wealth inequality is even greater than income inequality and a larger long-term problem in our country. And ultimately, right now, we've got a lot of people in the policy space just working on forming the concepts of how one might better tax wealth. Property taxes in some means are one way of trying to get at that, but they're not adequate to address the kinds of wealth acquisition that we've seen contemporaneously. And so we've got folks working at this at the federal level. We believe that for a wealth tax to be administrable at the state level, we would need it to be implemented at the federal level first. But in the meantime, there are opportunities for Illinois to, for example, lower its exemption level for its estate tax. If we were to drop our estate tax threshold to $1 million, you could raise around $690 million additional dollars a year. And another idea is enacting a mansion tax. Several jurisdictions, Washington State, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, are starting to enact higher transfer fees when there's a sale of a property. If a property is evaluated at a certain threshold, that could be $5 million, $3 million, whatever it is, but having a differential rate applied to that fee as another means of bringing in revenue and getting at taxation of wealth. And this entire bucket of reforms is also not surprisingly very progressive. So I had the fun job from a policy perspective of just saying what the in an ideal world, what the possible set of activities is and what would be recommended. And Senator Harman has the much harder job of moving those ideas from good ideas into political feasibility, let alone implementation. So at this time, I'll now shift that to him.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa, and Ann, thank you for your introduction. Ann and I have known each other since before I was in office, and Ann, you've always been a real champion of smart tax policy and wise investment. So appreciate the chance to share the panel with you today. Thanks also to the League for inviting me. It was this event last year in person, which I think was one of my very last in-person speaking roles without a mask on. And I've had very few even with a mask on since. But thanks for the invitation, and more importantly, thanks for your interest in our state and its financial future. We hear all kinds of the sky is falling negativity about Illinois. The truth is we're doing okay. Not great. We've got problems. That's no surprise, but it could be worse. And I say that fully embracing Dr. Worthington's conclusions, proven up by the presentation, that we have a antiquated regressive tax structure and an inherent structural deficit. I think you see that fiscal reality reflected in the budget proposal the governor offered this past week. First off, a mild disclaimer: this is Governor Pritzker's proposal. The General Assembly will spend the next several months reviewing it, holding hearings, seeing what changes should be made. That's our role. But at first glance, I think the governor has offered up a good faith effort to both recognize our financial realities and honor our commitments and priorities. It appears to be a balanced budget. The state's general fund is estimated to take in $41.7 billion in the coming budget year, and the governor budgets $41 billion in spending. So just so everyone's clear, the state budget year runs from July 1st through June 30th. We are currently in the 2021 budget year, and the governor is proposing his 2022 budget year plan. We're going through some unique times and challenges, and the governor's budget has some creative efforts to cope with that. For instance, the governor for 1 year would use $100 million from the cigarette tax increase to help support state operations. Now, the cigarette tax increase happened in 2019, and it was part of the funding plan for the statewide construction program. Now, COVID has sidelined a fair amount of these projects, so the governor's argument is that we could use 1 year's worth of that money without any negative effect on the capital program. Now, ideally, a year from now, we'll be past the pandemic and the economy will have rebounded, making such financial maneuvers unnecessary. Now, by and large, the governor is taking a look at all of the revenue coming into the Treasury, perhaps ignoring some traditional earmarks and figuring out the best use. It might rile some accountants, but we're coping with a global pandemic. And there is no increase in the state income or sales tax, which are Illinois' main sources of revenue. Our economy has actually outperformed expectations. That's allowed the state to pay off some loans faster than anticipated and to keep pace with bills coming in. As of yesterday, the backlog was barely over $5 billion. So for perspective, a backlog of somewhere between $3 to $3.5 billion represents a 30-day bill payment cycle, which is a good business standard. Under former Governor Rauner's budget impasse, that backlog hit a record $16.7 billion. So the trend is definitely in the right direction. Now, keep in mind, the governor and all of the rest of us were hoping to have an additional $3.1 billion from the fair tax amendment to address a lingering structural deficit. That did not go as hoped. So the governor's left to find creative ideas to balance spending. Now, you've inquired how soon another fair tax amendment could get on the ballot. The blunt answer is not soon enough, but the earliest would likely be November of 2022. But before you get to that, there are political and electoral issues to consider. First, you have to get through the House and the Senate with 3/5 majorities just to get it on the ballot. It took 10 years to pass the amendment out of the Senate the last time, and then it barely got the House votes required. And the House Democrats are down members since then. Now, second, the fair tax failed overwhelmingly. It managed to unite a fractured Republican Party behind one central cause. Election data shows some of the deepest blue areas of Chicago voted against it just as fervently as some of the darkest red areas of downstate. Now, look, I supported the fair tax. I sponsored the amendment in the Senate. But at this stage, I just don't know that putting it back on the ballot produces a different result. And I think the scope of its failure makes it difficult to get lawmakers to support putting it back on the ballot right now. Do I think the fair tax is the right thing for Illinois? Yes, absolutely. But it's an issue that needs to start over from square one with an entirely different marketing approach if it's going to get a new life in Illinois. The big question in the governor's budget is education. When you look at the numbers, it does not provide the additional $350 million increase for preschool through high school education. That's part of the evidence-based funding model formula. This would be the second year in a row that the state has come up short on that. In the current budget, we managed to keep schools with level funding. And as a result, no one lost funding compared to the previous year. The governor is hoping that federal education dollars can augment state funding and meet our goal. There are a lot of questions about how or if this will work. And I can tell you this, if there is a central truth about Senate Democrats, it's that we are always interested in finding resources for education. And I do not expect this year will be any different. Although the governor hopes to use federal dollars to assist with education funding, his budget does not rely on any funds from the relief package that President Biden is advancing in Washington. If that happens, and I hope it does, it would provide extra resources. Now, as someone who has taken a lot of criticism for advocating for federal aid to states, it's a relief and an encouragement to see the change in the White House. Illinois does not exist in a vacuum. The pandemic has hit the entire country hard. What helps us with our public health and economic problems also helps other states. The main point of political and media contention is that the governor's plan would be ending a series of business tax incentives and exemptions, which he calls corporate tax loopholes, to come up with more than $900 million in additional revenue. Now, from my standpoint, I see no problem with asking, what exactly are hardworking Illinoisans getting in return for these business tax breaks? The priority for any tax incentive should be maximizing employment. So let's put the programs under a microscope and keep what's working and get rid of what is not. You've also asked about one additional, even more difficult issue that we face, and that's the state's long-term plan for its pension debt. The short answer is we have to pay it. Now, we've lost several Illinois Supreme Court cases over efforts to reduce the debt by reducing benefits. And each time the court has been crystal clear that the pension protection in the Constitution was put there to prevent these very sorts of efforts. Now, ironically, Republican lawmakers in the Champaign-Urbana area created the pension clause during the 1970 Constitutional Convention. Representing a lot of higher education employees, they envisioned this very day when the state would try to shortchange retirement security to make up for decades of failing to invest in the pension system. So now we have constitutionally protected pension contracts. It would have been nice if those 1970 delegates would have also demanded the appropriate level of funding for those pensions, but that didn't happen. So here's the reality that we face. Throughout the entire history of our state, governors and legislative leaders did not invest the needed dollars into the retirement funds. The money was spent elsewhere on education, on public safety, everything else in the budget, and it kept our state taxes low. In the mid-1990s, Governor Edgar recognized that this was out of control and convinced the General Assembly to do something about it. The result was a 50-year financing plan, basically a mortgage through the year 2045. Now, unfortunately for us, that 50-year plan didn't really start making meaningful payments until year 16. The first 15 years were kept artificially low so they didn't blow a big hole in the state budget and force tax increases or horrible cuts. That was left to future lawmakers. And the result is that for the last decade, Illinois taxpayers have probably paid more into the pension funds than all of the previous history combined. And that's why we've had tax increases. That's why tuition has skyrocketed at public universities. It's the reason, or at least among the reasons, why property taxes have gone up, as local governments and school boards have to cover the funding that they'd hoped would have come from the state. I think a question we need to start asking ourselves is whether this payment plan is fair to current taxpayers who are being asked to sacrifice more than anyone else in our state's history. But for now, the governor's proposed budget makes the full $9.6 billion pension payment. Now, for perspective, $5.7 billion of that is for suburban and downstate teachers' retirement systems, teachers that don't even work for the state. Now, university employees and retirees are another $2.1 billion. State employees proper are only $1.6 billion. So I'm going to wrap up my remarks by answering another set of questions that you had about how to contact lawmakers and follow budget news. For budget news, I would suggest you check out our caucus website, which is www.illinoissenatedemocrats.com. It is a repository of all the things we're working on. It's also where you can find links to all of our social media accounts. We're constantly providing information and news across all of the social media platforms: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and a few others I don't even know how to use. As for contacting lawmakers during the pandemic, I've got two suggestions. If it's a local issue, reach out to the local office. Our senators and their local staffs have been responsibly maintaining office operations either in person or by forwarding phones to at-home offices. For bigger state issues, I'd suggest you go to our website, finding your lawmakers and using the contact web form. I know it seems a bit impersonal, but it is the most efficient way to figure out who cares about what and keep people informed. So thank you again for the invitation to speak to you and for your interest in the state, and I look forward to the questions.
Great. Thank you so much to all of our panelists today. This has been a great conversation. If you could all put on your video and we can just have a little discussion among ourselves here, and I will try to work in all the questions that have been popping up on the chat, but some of which have been really terrific. I'd like to start just really quickly with making this a bipartisan event and make sure that we know that there are information also on the Illinois Republicans websites, no doubt, as well. So just to sort of circle back real quickly to the corporate taxes, which you've all talked a little bit about. There have been questions. One is whether the CARES decoupling is included in the governor's budget assumptions. Senator Herman, perhaps you know the answer to that.
It is not. It is not included. It is still an active area of conversation. An effort to close that loophole failed in the House during our January session. But I think it will continue to be part of the conversation, especially as we start to wrestle with how to generate more revenue, for example, to fund that hoped for increase in education funding under the evidence-based model.
Okay, great. Some people have asked whether corporations will leave the state if there is more decoupling from the federal tax code. Are there opinions about that from our panelists?
Well, I can speak to that initially. So this decoupling of the latest CARES Act provisions, to decouple is just to maintain the status quo, right? It's just to reject a tax change that corporations are not currently benefiting from in the state. So, that there would be no change in their position. They would be the recipients of a windfall tax cut if we don't decouple. So the situation is not so much that they would have something that they've been previously benefiting from taken away from them.
It's even more benign than that. It's a net operating loss issue, and they can carry it forward into future tax years. So they can continue to recover this in future years. It's just not an immediate retroactive windfall that would pump. And they're going to get like 6 to 10 times as much in a federal refund already. So I do not expect it's going to influence behavior.
Okay, great. Would the panelists like to ask each other questions at this point?
I'll go out there. I'll go out there. This is for Senator Harmon. So a graduated income tax like the fair tax is absolutely one way to get to some progressivity in the tax structure. And as Lisa showed us, you know, states rely on sales taxes, states and local governments, sales taxes, property taxes, corporate income tax, individual income taxes. Where can you get the progressivity? It's on the income tax side. So you really have to work with the income tax. So that seems spot on. But what's the resistance to taking advantage of and doing a more aggressive sort of point on personal exemptions and just admitting don't have the flat tax, can't amend the state's constitution? Why not simply set a much bigger personal exemption and then use the flat rate and larger exemptions? You'll get average tax rates that rise over the income distribution, which is kind of what you're looking for. So what's the resistance there? That's something the legislature can do.
Yeah, and there have been discussions many times over the last 20 years about a sort of synthetic graduated tax using the personal exemption and other tools to create that. There will always be friction between good tax policy and tax politics. And I think that's just it right now, that the mechanism for doing that is twofold. You increase the personal exemption, but you also have to increase the tax rate. Mm-hmm. And for most taxpayers, they think only about the tax rate. You're raising my taxes from 3 to 4, and they haven't done the math to say, oh, but my taxes are actually going to go down because of the personal exemption. So it's just, that's the source of friction.
Okay. Lisa or Don, do you have questions for the other panelists?
I'm going to try to schedule a meeting with both of them to get their expertise, but I don't know that I have any questions right now.
Excellent.
I know that there's interest in general, and I see some questions in the chat as well about policy changes that would expand the tax base. And I really can't emphasize enough the value of doing that as a general matter, because a larger tax base means for any given revenue target, you can have lower rates, and it tends to offer some more resiliency to your tax revenue collections as the economy expands and contracts. So, for example, when I look at the growth rate of wage and salary income over a period of time, I see that the growth rate of taxable retirement income at the federal level is a lot higher. So the fact that the state does not include the federally taxable portion of retirement income in its own tax base means we are giving up any sort of access to that growing in share portion of income. So that's an example. Lisa also mentioned the sales tax situation in terms of services. Our state sales tax, by some measures, is basically 10th lowest in the US when you think about our sales tax base relative to personal income. We make up for it by having a high tax rate. And so our collections as a share of personal income are not that off, but that's because we have this high distortionary rate. So I just, from a policy perspective, think we need, when I'm thinking about Lisa's, what's big, what's bold, we need to make several moves at once. We need to make that tax base bigger in all these ways. And then that allows a more careful and nuanced conversation around what the rates and exemptions should be to reach any given revenue target that you have in mind, and try to accomplish some of your equity goals too.
Right. And I think adding on the sales tax, there's been a couple of questions about what's the magnitude of revenue that could be brought in, why hasn't that been done yet? On the magnitude side, it's it's huge. It's billions, multi-billions of dollars, depending on whether you're really, if you're doing the broadest possible base, maybe exempting business to business transactions to avoid pyramiding, it still is really quite substantial. The challenge is all on the political implementation, right? Because anytime you try to expand the base, you have every industry group with their, lobbyists coming to ask for a carve out. So it's really challenging to be able to pull in all of the parties, get the consensus to go along with, right, the base expansion in exchange for rate reduction, right, and other possible concessions that need to be made in order to get that through. But it's a policy idea that has support on all ideological sides of the aisle, right? Like the tax foundation, advocates for the broad expansion of the sales tax, folks on all ends. So I feel like the path towards building consensus would be long and hard, but should that be an idea that could be enacted, it would be a really good move and leave room for both lowering rates and bringing in some new money.
Yeah, and tax policy exists in a wonderful world of rationality and common sense, which has no relationship whatsoever to the political environment.
That's right.
I recently reread Phil Rock's memoir. Phil was the Oak Park senator a decade before I was, and my mentor. And it's a fascinating case study, the 1983 income tax and then the one in the early 90s. It was a partnership between Republican governors and a Democratic legislature. And that's what you really need on tax policy is a bipartisan agreement that this is good policy and something that we have to do for the state. It was, in my view, the biggest missed opportunity of the Rauner administration. It could have led on a bipartisan reform of tax policy. But now we have, Democrats and Republicans throwing stones at each other, and it is not conducive to smart tax policy. We'll do the best that we can, but we will do it in a barrage of sticks and stones.
And what can the role of the league be in trying to create that kind of environment?
The league has always done a good job of trying to force that rationality and common sense into the political sphere. And you, because of your bipartisan nature, because of your geographic reach, you have that ability to get in front of folks who would otherwise be prone to throwing sticks and stones and argue for rationality and cooperation.
Okay. There's a really good question, I think, in the chat about how maybe there are some other states out there that have faced challenges similar to ours with deep holes, and have they found a path out of that situation? Can you cite some optimistic light at the end of the tunnel kind of examples for us? Maybe not as bad as we are, but sort of in that ballpark.
We have some fellow strugglers in Pennsylvania and New Jersey.
New Jersey,
huge state, huge moves this last year in moving forward some progressive, high revenue yielding tax reforms.
And Lisa, maybe you would remember this better than I do at this point, but couldn't we say that 10 years ago, California kind of took this seriously and took some pretty aggressive steps to put a steep graduated rate structure in place and so forth. And, there's different points of view on, exactly how that all worked out, but I think their situation really has stabilized relative to ours here in Illinois.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what Governor Jerry Brown inherited and then what he left with was quite different, and that wasn't all implemented perfectly, and that like the graduated rate structures were also accompanied with sales tax increases, right, in order to address primarily education needs and gaps in that funding. But voters went back to the ballot on multiple occasions to extend those tax changes and to ultimately make them permanent or quasi-permanent, extend them out another 15 years, 20, 25 years. So it spoke to the fact that ultimately there was the political consensus at the end of the day to make that a permanent part of their tax structure.
Okay, great. There's hope.
One final question about so when we are successful in raising this additional revenue, how can we be sure that it will go to education, to the evidence-based funding? Certainly a large part of the campaign against the fair tax tried to instill fear about legislators. So how do we assure people that, they're doing their best, they will indeed spend it appropriately?
I think that's a hard one. I don't know. Senator Harmon, how do we do that?
You have to hold us accountable. The truth is that the political pressure and direction is to do just that. The evidence-based funding model was a radical overhaul of how we fund schools. And for the first several years, we lived up to our expectation to continue to add money on a scheduled pace, not nearly as fast as we would like, but we continued to do that until the bottom fell out last year. So I hope we can get back on that schedule. And that is a politically advantageous thing for legislators to do. So the problem is the competition. There are 100 other noble causes, increasing rates for home service providers. There are all sorts of things that we should be spending more on to provide the quality services that Dr. Worthington mentioned we were coming up short on. But you just, increasing spending, if we are spending money on the right good things, is not a sin. But when we do that, even when after the income tax went into effect, we increased spending on our pension obligations, and we got kicked in the teeth for increasing spending. I don't know how else you deal with that new money that comes in from the tax increase other than to spend it responsibly on things that taxpayers want us to spend the money on. But we'll still get walloped for spending more money.
No good deed goes unpunished. So we truly appreciate Ms. Gee, Dr. Worthington, and Senator Harmon joining us today. Once again, if you'd like to be part of the League's Google group for fiscal policy, please put your email in the chat. If you have additional questions or your questions have not been addressed today, there certainly were a lot that were submitted. Please send them to issues@lwvil.org, and we'll try to get answers for you. And now, please, you've got a bit of a break. Please join us at 11:45 for our next session, Housing is Everything, the Role of Housing as a Determinant of Economic Success. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.